Alistair, and good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us on this webinar. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly at pace, I hope. I'm going to be asking a couple of questions, but if you have that, I'm going to ask you to respond via chat, and then Grant will sort of summarize that for us at the end when we do open it up for wider questions as well. So the research questions that we were trying to address through this survey, again, was originally intended to, check in, is our V-Leader content relevant, and to what extent we may or may not have to change. And the questions that we were trying to understand is, do leaders have an accurate view of how their people are coping when we're all working virtually? And, we wanted to check an assumption. Do introverted people work better at being virtual than extroverts? And to what extent is virtual just working better for some people? We want to understand, does prior experience working in a virtual environment, whether it was like sometime or all the time, is that making a difference to how they're coping now? And then finally, trying to understand, are there sort of particular leadership activities that seem to have the greatest or at least impact on the team? So who responded to the survey? So we were quite happy with the response. The survey was live about, I think it was 4 or 5 days in total. And, we sent it out to our network, and we used LinkedIn and Facebook to promote it. And 360 people responded. Well over half of those were team leaders themselves. Quite happy with the response. And then we also asked some questions. So we just wanted to, are you an introvert or an extrovert or both? And the majority of people are clearly saying, I'm not one or the other, I'm in between. And we're quite happy with the age range that we received, although unfortunately not a whole lot of young people in terms of under 25. Who else responded? Quite happy with the range of organizations, so anywhere from less than 500 to more than 10,000. How many direct reports is, you can see there, again, a range, although the majority, 2/3 of people are managers of teams of 6 or less. And then a lot of experience as well. So over half of people with 10 or more years of leading people experience. So it's just the basic demographics, so you understand, who responded. But now sort of probably the bits that you're really more interested in is the question that we asked is, first research question, do leaders have an accurate view of how their people are coping? And so 2 things came out of this. One, the actual question, but also something interesting in terms of challenging our assumptions. So how do we ask? So we asked individuals, team members, were certain activities such as learning and development, has that experience increased or decreased for you since you started working virtually with COVID? And so here, as an example, you can see that team members said, in actual fact, about 15% said it had increased, but another sort of 35% saying it had decreased. But then we asked managers, do you think that your team members have, have less or more experience with learning and development now that they're working virtually? And we found quite consistently that team leaders have a more positive view of their experience than what their team members' reality would suggest. So here you can say that it's over, team leaders are almost more than twice as positive, that in fact team members are increasing their learning and development since working virtually. So we continued with this process with asking these questions. So do you, team members, has your feedback from your manager on your performance increased or decreased? And once again, managers are feeling that in fact they're giving more feedback than what their team members are experiencing. But also that team leaders, not a big difference here, but team leaders may be underestimating the hours that their team members are working. And team members are slightly more positive about their productivity than their team leaders. Now, the interesting thing here for us, though, is, remember back in April or March when this all started, there was a whole lot of worry about, productivity is going to go down, how we're going to manage this. But in actual fact, regardless of the first message, is there a disconnect in terms of team leaders and team members are seeing things? half of the people are saying that productivity is actually increased, and and just slightly less than that than team leaders are thinking productivity has increased. Team members are feeling that only roughly about 12 or 13% feel that the connection has improved with other teams. But then connection with manager is more positive, but again, the manager is thinking the connection is more positive, and then fairly spot on with connection between the team members themselves. So this is another really sort of surprising thing. I mean, we really thought the connection was really going to nosedive whilst working virtually and working remotely from each other. But in actual fact, the majority of people are saying it's either increased or stayed the same. So a number of assumptions I think have been challenged that we originally had back in April. But so then finally something interesting happened in terms of team members. It switched around. So team members are more positive about their health and well-being. And team members are also less likely to think that their stress and anxiety has increased versus what their team leaders think has occurred. So very sort of interesting question there in terms of what's happening with this. Do team leaders need to take further steps in terms of making sure that they truly understand the reality that their people are experiencing whilst working virtually and remotely? The other question, of course, is introverted better at virtual? So the assumption was, in common sense, would say, well, of course, introverted people must be much better at working virtual. They may have a preference, but is it better? And what we found is that there was virtually no relationship between introversion or extroversion against the survey questions that I've just showed you previously. So, except something really interesting came up, is that introverted managers are much more positive about the experience that they believe that their team leaders are having, or their team members are having, compared to extroverted team leaders. So in this case, introverted managers were twice as likely to believe that connections between team members within their team has significantly improved. So here I want to highlight significantly improved, right? Because we asked questions, where the response was, did it stay the same, did it increase or improve, or did it significantly improve? And the big difference was that category of significantly improved, not necessarily improved or stayed the same. And 3 times more likely to say introverted managers were to say that productivity has significantly improved. 6 times more likely regarding the connections between them and their staff, and 6 times more likely to feel that connections between other teams has significantly improved, and even twice as more likely to believe that there's been some improvement than extroverted managers. Yeah, and then this crazy number, 9 times more likely to believe that health and well-being had significantly improved, and even twice as likely to believe that there's been some improvement. So the question that we have for you, so we have some theories in terms of why that might be, is what do you think might be the reasons introverted managers are much more likely to incorrectly interpret the experience of their teams in this positive way? So we'd love it if you could respond via chat, and my colleague Grant at the end of this webinar will be summarizing that and another question that we'll have for you later. The other question is working virtual better for some people more than others? And of course, the question is yes. So what we found was that about 1/4 of the respondents appear to feel that virtuals work better for them. So this is about preference. It could be both, but we're looking for evidence of actually working better. And so we found that there's remote working for about a core group of 25 people, 25%. Most things were better for them. So their stress and anxiety had reduced. Their assessment of their well-being and productivity, their self-assessment of their productivity had all increased since working remotely. So as an example, so people responded that around my stress and anxiety, 27% saying that it had decreased since working virtually. And then another sort of 37% saying that my health and well-being had increased since working virtually. And then finally, a whopping, was that 52% saying that my productivity has increased. So what we then did is take a look at all the people who responded positively to all 3 of those questions. And we found that there was about 25% of people responded who were saying, no, that core group of people, this has worked out better for me. My stress and anxiety, my health and well-being, my productivity has all improved since working virtually. And then we asked, does prior experience working in virtual make a difference now? And so this is going to lead to the second question that we're going to be asking you to respond via chat. And what we found was the answer was no. And this is really quite surprising, because you would think that working virtually in the past, either all the time or at least some of the time, would have some sort of correlation to how well things are going for you or how you're coping now. But we found no. In fact, there was even less correlation in this than the questions around introversion or extroversion. It seemed completely random. So how do we do that? So we asked some questions. We asked what were or are the work arrangements in your immediate team? And so the responses were things like, well, some of my team worked virtually, half my team worked virtually, or most or all. And before COVID, you can see that, well, the vast majority of people, at best, maybe worked, some of the team did work virtually, and then quite a bit, almost half said never worked virtually at all. And of course, no surprise, that completely switches to the other end, where 80% of the people are saying that most, if not all, my team is working virtually. And then we also asked the frequency. So you as individuals, how often were you working virtually versus now? And so again, no surprise, is that almost a third of people said that I never worked virtually at all, but more than half said sometimes. So the majority of people either at sometimes or often or always worked virtually at some extent. And then of course that just a curiosity that totally changes now in terms of only 3% are still never working virtually. And just as out of interest, we asked, well, when your employer reopens, how frequently do you want to work virtually? And we all know through all the sort of the research and the news and what we're all hearing through the grapevine is, should things ever go back to normal, there's a whole lot of people who are saying, you know what, I don't want to continue working full-time in the office. I want to be working virtually at least sometimes during the week. So you can see here that the majority of people want to work virtually at least some of the time, or often or always. Very few people are saying, I want to go back full-time. And then we asked leaders finally, we asked team members, did your team leader lead virtually prior to COVID? And you hear that a good solid 25% did. And what we found was when we looked at the responses of those people who worked or led virtually prior, there was no impact. Experience has no impact on how they're coping now in terms of leading or working virtually. And again, that's a big surprise. What might that be? And so the second question that we want to have for you, that we want to sort of hopefully have time to discuss, is what do you think? Why would the reasons be that, or at least within our data, is suggesting that prior experience is not really helping in this situation that we're in now? Okay. So really getting into the crux now in terms of trying to understand, like, what's getting some practical ideas in terms of what's working and what's not working with leading virtually. And during the rehearsal and through a number of times of going through this information, I really struggled with how to convey this and share this. I played with graphs, I played with, and I said, let's show them the data, and Alistair and Grant said, no, that's still not working. So I'm going to start off by with this statement, is that we do know that psychology, there's lots of research that our brain weighs more heavily on the fear of loss than the promise of gain. So that, there's things like research that says that our brain, in terms of the level of how it reacts, it reacts a lot more in terms of the fear of losing $1 is greater than the potential promise of gaining $1.50. for instance. And that keeps coming up over and over again in the psychology research. And it seems to appear to happen within this data as well. So I'm going to show one graph, and then I'm going to sort of talk through it. So if you could just go down to the bottom here in terms of significantly increased. So this is saying, looking at people saying, my stress and anxiety has significantly increased. And then we married that up in terms of how did they feel about the level of change of recognition that they're receiving. And you can see that 70% of them are saying that recognition from their manager has reduced. So 70%. Yet when we go up here, in terms of, at the very top, in terms of people who are saying my stress and anxiety has significantly reduced, only 27% of them are saying that recognition has increased, right? Big chunks around not that it has stayed the same. That relationship happened consistently through all the questions, is that the loss of something had a far greater impact on a negative impact on outcomes like stress and anxiety, health and well-being, my sense of connection, than the manager working to actually try to improve things more than they were before. So, as an example, among the people who said that stress and anxiety had reduced, were as likely to say that the connection with their team leader had decreased as increased. There was no difference. But among the people who said that stress and anxiety had increased, they were 5 times more likely to say that the team connection had decreased as others that would say that had increased. So that sense of loss has a far greater impact than the sense of loss of things since COVID has a far greater negative impact than the positive impacts of trying to improve some of these things as a leader. Other examples. So reduction in feedback on performance had exactly the same relationship. Reduction in connection with manager had the same impact, and reduction in learning and development, access to learning and development, had exactly the same impact in terms of loss looms larger than gain. So clearly one of the things that came out of that was a manager who's maybe struggling or feeling busy or overwhelmed should at the very least try to stem the view that, or stop the view that there's a sense of loss in terms of my people should not feel that I am giving less recognition, that they're not getting less sort of feedback on their performance. At least do that. That is probably the biggest return on your effort, investment of your effort in terms of trying to maintain the team. Again, so what other sort of leadership activities is that we found that connection with teammates appear to be much more important than connection with the manager. The majority of the challenges identified in comments relate to connection with the immediate team, right? So that's, I think, is quite important because I think a lot of managers are really focusing on making sure that I'm connecting with my team, that I'm having one-on-ones, that they feel valued, but they may not be focusing as much in terms of how do I make sure that the team feels connected with each other, because everything in this data is saying that the connection with the team, between team members, is one of the most important things to consider. Almost half the comments from people who believe that connection with teammates has increased, those comments, those verbatims, half of them relate to the amount of regularity, and that it isn't just task, that they're looking at how do we meet to have fun, how to have social, how do we find some sort of way to have these sort of incidental interactions. People are feeling the loss of the random water cooler conversations, or the conversations that happen in the kitchenette. Also, a big surprise is that connection with other teams doesn't seem to matter about anything at all. It has no impact. In actual fact, people who said that productivity had increased were 3 times more likely to say that the connection outside the team with other teams has decreased. And so we're asking, are people happily becoming more siloed? Or is it that, in some ways, I think that before COVID, and then quickly realized once we all started working virtually after the first lockdown, is, wow, a lot of those meetings, maybe they weren't really that necessary in the first place. Is that sort of extending into the situation now? Or is the situation just causing those people that are happy to be siloed, is creating a bit of a spiral for them? Oh, again, some more activities that came up in terms of the data and the verbatims. Like I said before, the biggest impact on productivity was the connection with teammates. There was almost a one-for-one relationship between connection with teammates and productivity. As connection with teammates went down, so did productivity, and vice versa. No surprise, the presence of stress and anxiety has a far greater negative impact on productivity than the absence of stress has a positive impact. And again, we know that from very well-regarded psychology research. 75% of people who said that their productivity had increased also said that their physical health and well-being has also increased at the same time. Whoops, sorry, I went there too quick. So here's some good solid hints and tips for leaders to start thinking about in terms of, if they haven't done it already, where they might sort of start focusing some of their efforts. We also asked some of the verbatims. I'm not going to go through all of it. I think I've only selected 2 verbatims to share with you. One of was, if you could give your manager some feedback or advice about leading you virtually during this next year, what would it be? So this no correlation in terms of whether you're happy or not happy with your manager. Just give us some feedback or feedback what you would give. And the top themes of those were increase your availability and visibility, and have more regular check-ins. And those check-ins should be more around encouraging interaction and inclusion between the team members, right? So again, real emphasis, not just the one-on-one with the managers, but the managers actually trying to figure out how do all team members feel included and they're interacting with each other. And empathy came up so often. This idea my manager needs to understand how I'm really coping. My manager doesn't ask, my manager doesn't seem to care. And a real difference in terms of the positive sort of theme around when those managers who really did show real empathy and the positiveness that came out of verbatims and communicate often. Real differences between verbatims around people who said, I only meet with my manager once a week, versus who may be talking to the manager once a day or once every couple of days. So I'm not going to go through these in detail, but you will get the deck after this. And the other one was, what tactics has your manager used that has really made a difference to overcome the challenges? And so those themes were get that balance right between social, task, social interaction, and fun. There was a lot of consistent feedback on a couple of things in terms of managers who focus solely on task with very little about all the other aspects, the social and fun and how are you coping, how are you doing. Those managers got beat up a fair bit. And when we compared those verbatims and linked them up to the data, big difference in terms of how those employees are responding to the other sort of consequences in terms of how connection, whether their health, or well-being, and stress was how that was being managed, going up and down. Focus on task sends a really strong message that I'm not trusted, because you're constantly watching me, following me up on what I'm doing, and you don't actually care about whether I'm coping or not. So really increase those number of one-to-ones and those catch-ups. We found that relying only on one sort of IT platform to connect socially tended not to work. The ones that seemed to talk about things were working well is that they had multiple platforms that they were using for different purposes. And so the other sort of piece of advice is, if you have one, are there other platforms to use? And again, finally, focus on well-being. It's well-being and empathy. Repeat, repeat, repeat. So I'm going to finish up by just giving, what did we get from it? Some actionable tips for you that you could take away from this. Remember that it's actually not about you. So while you as a leader may be focusing on making sure that I'm connecting with my staff, that they ensure that that I understand how they're coping and whatnot, people want that, but they're actually more concerned about how they're interacting with their team and their teammates, and you can't you need to sort of can't ignore that, and you may need to sort of step in and sort of try to not impose a process, but lead and nurture that. Check in often and with empathy over and over again. Ensure you really understand how your team is coping. And as you found, if you feel like you're an introverted manager, you may need to maybe work a bit harder at making sure that you have an accurate understanding of your employees' reality. The other thing that we found is delegate the team approach to maintaining social connection, collaboration, and projects. So how is that going to work? Right? What social platforms? How often? What we found is that when the manager actually designed it and for all intents and purposes imposed a solution, that tended to fail. What tended to succeed is when the leader actually asked the team, can you figure out how we're going to do this? And then empowered them and asked them to do that. And what we also found is that quite often the first attempt at figuring it out might fail. And so just encourage that, sort of keep experimenting, keep going until we as a team find a rhythm, a series of platforms and workflow that seems to really work for us. But then the other problem is you've got to really worry about Groundhog Day, because we're all feeling this sense of Groundhog Day. Every day is starting to feel like the other when we're working from home the vast majority of times. So we're finding that it's really important to try to mix it up, make it a routine to be unroutine somehow. Is something that can be quite effective as well. But bear in mind that you still have to have frequent meetings, shorter and sharper, just more frequent, and less emphasis on task and more emphasis on the softer things. One more slide. Busy leaders should really focus on avoiding the perception of loss of connection, feedback, and recognition. Right? So at the very least, try to give that sense that that the amount of feedback that I give, the level of recognition, the connection, that hasn't at least reduced. That can have the biggest impact, at least in terms of maintaining things, than trying to improve things or maintain the status quo. Ask your team to find and test more than one online platform. One platform seems to fail. If your team, really think, if the majority of your meetings tend to be more about task, your people will probably start feeling like, at least according to the people who responded, feel that you're micromanaging me and you don't trust me. And then finally, really watch out for your teams becoming too siloed. Are they not engaging with other teams? And to what extent is that a problem? And to what extent you might have to sort of address that. Now, that's where we're going to stop. So I'm actually going to just, before we open up for questions and for Grant, Alistair has asked if he could just have about a couple of minutes just to talk about the Be Leader training that we've developed, because this was the original purpose of the research, to sort of inform that content. So I'll just hand over briefly to Alistair.
Thanks, Darin. Hopefully I'm coming up on the...
You are.
Okay, that's good. If you could go to the next slide, and this will be, 60 seconds. This is a slide that I stole from Darin's presentation because I wanted to present it. This is obviously a question where we asked, to what extent do you think your manager, on the left-hand side, it's a result from the team members, would benefit from virtual leadership training? 55% of team leaders said yes, they would. They agreed, or they strongly agreed. And the leaders agreed even more. That they wanted virtual training. And as most of us know, leadership is leadership. It's just a question of how do you tweak processes in exactly the way that Darin has been describing. The impacts of what we do is slightly different virtually, and certain things work and certain things don't work. And I think one of the things, looking through the data the other day, that I concluded is that managers and leaders haven't actually been as creative as they could have been. There's so many great ideas out there about different ways of doing things, and you know, the general response has just been to do lots more meetings. And as Darin has just pointed out, once you get into the routine of that, it just drives everybody crazy. So if I could have the next slide, Darin. So we've built a core curriculum. None of this will be, it's absolutely not rocket science. This, you know, focus and performance is critical. You know, ensuring connection, we just, you know, literally, Darin's just talked about that nonstop. Making sure that the team is still learning. So we're developing virtual teams, and the wellbeing piece, all of these things I think most of us on this call would know. And all of those are wrapped up by needing to be really effective from a high performance perspective in terms of communication, like really good communication skills. So if I could very briefly have the next slide, Darin. So we built a self-paced piece, which is, you know, 3 hours online, and we've also created some Fastlead pods where we get 3 or 4 leaders together to discuss these issues. So if you're interested in that, let us know. Grant, over to you for questions, and maybe onto your next slide, Darin.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Darin. Thank you, Alistair. Darin, I'm going to throw you into the deep end to start, because I thought we might, let's keep it very interesting. There have been a lot of comments and questions about onboarding. Is there anything in the survey that you think would help people who are trying to onboard new staff, or is there any advice you'd give?
So in actual fact, nobody, from what I remember, nobody was actually offering solutions around onboarding, but a lot of people are saying, got to figure this out, and how do we do that? So I think from the research that I've seen elsewhere, and just sort of talking about what's happening out there as well, is I don't think anyone's sort of fully landed on it as well. So everyone's sort of experimenting. But what it comes down to is actually the same thing, is that you really need to, your presence now, your virtual presence as an organization is more important than it ever has been. So in terms of your corporate, or sort of your external facing website, your intranet, how aligned is the look and feel and the content of that to your value proposition, to your company's vision, your purpose, your culture? Does it feel and smell like it is your culture and your organization? You will have to look at your onboarding content. If that was done face-to-face, is how can you actually then translate that to some sort of online series of quick events in interactions? And if your organization doesn't sort of have that sort of capability in-house, there are organizations that can help you to build that sort of highly interactive, and it's important to say it's a series, right? So, I mean, a lot of you may have had onboarding activities and workshops that may have, you know, will take people out for a week or a day or two and bring them all together. You just can't do that online. So it's how do you actually create these episodic series of interactive, engaging events that is done with real people as well, right? So it can't be just a series of automated online content that you just sort of click through. It has to be led like this and facilitated with a real person on the other end talking to new employees as much as possible. But again, I think we're all sort of struggling and trying to figure out how to do that. But so far, that seems to be the stuff where it's working seems to be heading.
Thank you. We've had some more questions about siloing. I mean, you've talked about this a little bit, but just to sort of maybe focus quite directly on it, do you think we're losing that long-term connectivity across the organization? And do you think there's anything people can do about it?
Well, I think the reality is yes, that is that connection with the wider organization, that connection with culture is going to be diminishing. And I know a lot of people are really sort of stressed and struggling with how do we maintain culture within the organization when everyone's working remotely. And to me, the way around it is maybe not necessarily around focusing on culture, but narrowing the conversation to getting really sort of clear on your organization's purpose and how it achieves that purpose. And we talked about that briefly at another webinar, is what that gives a focus. It's a North Star when things are uncertain. And if you get your purpose right, that sort of implies the type of behaviors that are necessary in order to deliver on that purpose. The other point is, I think leaders need to think purposefully and deliberately about how do I create tasks and projects that actually require working with other teams for no other reason than to work with other teams, right? How do I facilitate and nurture that? Because it's going to be a spiral if we just keep, we're very tribal, and any sort of reason for human beings to revert back to their tribes, we tend to take it. So those type of project works, program work, if you have to create it, do it. But you need to find practical reasons that people need to interact with each other on a work basis, because doing it, that some of those social things online that you do with the intimate team in terms of having drinks, that might be some of the feedback we got was the social really works unless it is a sense that it's been forced or it's too formulaic. So it's more likely that's if you're creating these social online situations with people outside the team, could that become a sense of formulaic? So it could be dangerous. So I think the first step is re-engaging with people outside and other teams through very real project work, programs of work.
Okay, so Michelle has mentioned that she has a number of people, I'm assuming in her team, who are communicating without video, just sort of, they're on chats, but they're low bandwidth, so they're not doing that kind of thing. When I put this this session out to sort of my social networks and asked people to comment on it, I got a whole bunch of comments back from people who worked in tech who were very unhappy about the way their co-workers dealt with video conferences, in that they refused to appear. They were clearly extremely disengaged. I mean, is it possible in a remote world to have team meetings in which people are not using video?
I think it's possible, and it's a really sort of interesting question. So you're right. When video is turned off, and I as a presenter looking at a bunch of names and no faces, I mean, even this is confronting. So let alone being in a team meeting with colleagues who I work with closely who are refusing to put in, not putting their video. So I, as a leader, how I would manage that is say that, look, I have, my preference would be that at least at some point throughout the week through our regular meetings is that you meet, that you share your video, especially if it's around the social stuff. Like if we're just talking about task, so be it, keep it to task. But in those meetings that you've organized to, like, hey, let's just check in with each other, how we're doing, or let's have some fun, or on a Friday over drinks. I think it's better if the video is on. But it's dangerous right now because, some people are not coping. And people may be in situations that they don't want you to see their face because they're really struggling. And to be on camera is going to set them off. And I really don't want to go down this really deep negative point. But there's a certain reality here that has been shared with me. And the reality is that things like domestic violence and that kind of an emotional abuse we knew was going to increase when this started, and the data is saying that it's happening. And the research is showing that there are people who do not want to share their video because they don't want to show that there has been some sort of abuse. Now that could be physical abuse or other types of abuse, which is not shown physically, but it's going to show up on their face through how their stress and how they're coming across. So it's a really big balancing act that leaders need to take, and there's no magic answer to that. But I really think people who are saying people should not put pressure on others to show their face on video, but and be understanding, but people should also put it out there and say, if you're okay with it, would you be willing to maybe once a week go on video? Some sort of compromise. And I'm sorry that I had to take it down that sort of path, but it is a reality that's been shared with me that I think is quite important.
Well, this actually quite neatly brings us on to the next question. Just so people are aware of the timing, what we generally do is run till about now, which is 8:45. Often some people have to leave because they have meetings at 9 o'clock, they need to prepare or whatever. If you do need to go, that's totally fine. We will keep the Q&A running for a little bit longer. And if you have more questions, please put them in and we'll try and get them in before we finish. So just to go on to the next question, that sort of question about being empathic about people who don't necessarily want to appear on video. Megan asked quite a lot earlier, do we think empathy and connection are being lost in the virtual world, or is the feeling of loss just what we're used to with physical space? Is it an actual loss of connection, or are we just missing the space?
I think it's a good question, and off the top of my head, I would suggest is that we are, I think it is a loss of connection predominantly. However, that connection doesn't seem to be lost with the people that we work closest with, right? So because I need to work with people on a daily basis, I have now become accustomed to obtaining my sense of connection through a screen and through frequent conversations via email or social platforms or online through video, right? So there may have been sort of this, and I certainly felt it at the beginning, a real sense of loss of connection with people. But I've become accustomed to it, and I don't feel like I'm missing anything anymore in terms of my immediate space. But what I am missing is a sense of connection with a wider group of people in my network, right? So, and I've spoken to Alistair a fair bit, is I miss the just those random coffees that I used to have with people, and you bump into them and just, we haven't seen each other in a while. Can we have a chat over coffee or just have a casual conversation? And I find it difficult to reach out to people who I don't see every day and say, hey, let's just have a catch up online. It seems too formal. At least that's what I'm struggling with. So I'm not sure if I answered the question. I think the question is, my answer is yes and no. So I think the sense of connection, we've overcome it within our immediate space. But I don't think we've sort of figured out how we're going to maintain that connection with the wider world.
Oh, pardon me. Okay, we have a question from Leanne, that it's interesting that people don't seem particularly worried about losing connection with other teams versus their own teams. Do we have anything in the data that talks about how this would impact a larger cohesive culture?
Culture didn't come out per se too much within the verbatims. It wasn't discussed, and leaders themselves didn't sort of mention that in terms of what challenges are you facing. They don't seem to be too concerned about culture per se. They're more concerned about their immediate team and how they manage that. But what we do know is sense of culture is going to get lost. I mean, there's the whole, the whole sort of sociological, anthropomorphic sort of research view about cultures. How is culture built and maintained? Culture is built and maintained through the daily sort of connections that we have with each other, and how we react in order to, first, how do I have to interact and behave within this environment that I am to firstly survive, and then once that is managed, then how do I have to react and behave in a way to thrive within this environment, within this group of people that I interact in with that, and that forms into social norms and ways of working and habits. But when that is not being informed on a regular basis, on a daily basis, and a minute by minute basis, in fact, that sense of culture is in real threat. And I'm not really sure anyone sort of landed in terms of how to manage culture. Where I've landed personally in terms of the research that I've done, and I know I'm biased because if you've been on a webinar that I've done previously, you know that I've really sort of landed on this view that at this point in time, purpose, your organizational purpose, is something that you can really leverage. And if you think deeply about how can I embed a sense of purpose in my team, in terms of a direction that we're going, what does that mean in terms of a set of behaviors that are necessary to deliver on that purpose? It's more narrow. It's a more narrow view, but it might be more manageable than managing this sense of culture. But your culture, by implication, gets managed by focusing on something like purpose, right? So have I been able to prove that? Not yet, but I certainly seek to. And it's just a view and a theory that I'm having at the moment. But the reality is that everyone is really worried about culture and how does it get managed. And again, like onboarding, I think we're all experimenting with different ways of nailing that problem. But I don't think anyone's sort of come out with and saying, I think I've found the solution.
Okay, so I think, do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, I'm happy to keep going as long as there's
Okay,
people, there's one person online willing to listen.
Well, let's do let's do one more question and then ask Alistair to sum up. So I think there was definitely in the data, there was sort of quite a lot of commentary. I worked on one section of the data, and there was quite a lot of commentary on organized social events. Could you talk a little to the idea of what constitutes an online social event that people actually find useful, and what constitutes one that they maybe weren't so keen on?
Yeah. So the quickest and most obvious answer that came out of that through the verbatims is when the manager designed, directed, and for all intents and purposes, here's my solution. This is how I think we need to socially interact with each other. This is how we're going to have fun. We're going to do this. We're going to do this sort of online trivia quiz, and next week we're going to do that. It tended to fail, or it was more likely to fail than if the team members themselves worked together and experimented and tried finding different ways in terms of how this is going to work. How are we going to have fun with each other online, right? So if the manager imposes a solution, that's where it seemed like it was more formulaic, too structured. This seems forced. It's not working for me. And again, I'm worried that in terms of you take that approach in terms of how do I then socialize with people outside my team to try and get that sense of connection again, because it's clearly that's where the biggest loss is seen. You're going to be formulaic. So the key is get the team thinking about how to do it. They'll need to experiment, but also mix it up. So a Friday weekly quiz, trivia quiz, is going to get boring quick, right? So shake it up, like you normally would in real life. Before COVID, is that you didn't necessarily do the same thing every Friday night. So online social drinks over a trivia or something else every Friday night will tend to fail over time and feel forced. So mix it up and empower your team is really the two big pieces of advice.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you, Darin. Thank you, everybody. Al, do you want to do a finale?
Yeah, I mean, very kind. I'm just reflecting on what Darin has just said there, because I kind of do the same thing every Friday night, maybe in real life. So I need to really sort of zoom that up. Okay, first and foremost, Darin, I know you just spent an enormous amount of time for the last 3 or 4 days crunching this data and getting deep into it. So I really appreciate all of the work you put in. It's a really interesting discussion that we've had. We're now in this zone of living and working with COVID. We all know it's not going away for a period of time. So I think that requires us now to start thinking about what are our settings going forward. And, I think the data really that you've described shows that it needs to be different folks, different strokes for different folks. That's thoughts for all of us really in terms of, how are we leading, what's working, what's not. It's going to be quite different, I think, for everybody in different circumstances, but we need to get people thinking a little bit more long term about what they're doing as leaders. So thanks very much for joining. We'll no doubt have a couple more of these sort of things as we go forward. Please connect with us around anything you've got in this area that you think would be interesting to us, or that we have got that might be interesting to you, and have an unbelievably productive virtual day.
Thank you very much, everybody.